This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans.
All right, welcome back to Transparency, everyone. We're excited to have with us today Lisa Selin Davis, and I'll hold up this book for those that are viewing on YouTube. Tomboy has just been released as a paperback version. Has it been published as paperback throughout the world now, Lisa, or North America release? Or
that's a great question. I know in North America, I don't know outside. Yeah. It's coming out in Japan soon.
Is it? Fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed the book. It's quite a trip down memory lane for me. We must be about the same age, so references to growing up in the 70s and 80s was a real trip down memory lane for me. And some of the names that you mentioned as historical tomboys, like Laura Ingalls Wilder and Jodie Foster, and who else did you name? Christy McNichol. All my childhood heroes and some childhood crushes growing up. So it was a nostalgic read. I think where I would like to start is just asking you kind of how this book came about and why you were interested in writing and investing this kind of research energy and writing energy into the topic of tomboys.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to both of you. The book came out of, well, first of all, I did something that a lot of freelance writers do, which is once I had kids, I started writing more stuff about parenting. And, early on when kids were in preschool, when kids were starting to divide themselves by sex more, which they don't do, till around 2.5, 3. And my kid all the girls had gone off to play princess, and there was mine. Happy to play princess as long as she was not a princess, and playing with boys and girls, but like a little bit more with boys, and just generally not doing what the other girls were doing. And because there were no models of tomboys left, really, we have so few young masculine females around, and B, because it turns out nobody really understands this kind of early childhood gender nonconformity or normalizes it. I don't think anyone at the preschool knew anything about it. I was trying to make meaning out of it. What does it mean that she's doing that? What does it portend? Is she trans? Is she a lesbian? Now when I have people who reach out to me and ask me about it, I say, like, don't worry, there's nothing to do but be happy, because if you have a child resisting gender norms, you don't have to do all that work to try to get them to resist gender norms, and just let them explore. And it doesn't mean there's no way to tell what it means, but no one had that script ready for me. And I wrote about it. And I wrote about it for Parenting Magazine, and it just got thrown up on the web the day the magazine closed. So it was never edited. And there was an essay that said, with the title, "My Daughter Wants to Be a Boy." This was 2013, and no one was fighting about this topic at all. And nobody cared. And I got a few comments of like, oh, I relate to that kind of wanting your child to be exceptional, but wanting to fit in, and wanting them to not need approval, but wanting them to get it. That's what that essay was about. 4 years later, my child was in elementary school, and it was, the kids were kind of adjusting. It was a little harder for the adults around her who, what I realize now is kept trying to facilitate her social transition, but I didn't have that language then. Again, like thinking they were doing the right thing and being helpful, and not really understanding that gender nonconformity itself, there's like nothing that needs to be done about it. It's not a problem. And even the doctor constantly being like, who are you? Do you want to change? Do you want to? And I thought it was all very sweet and caring, but I think there was a sense of like, we've got one, here it is, a live trans child. And so I wrote this piece that was like, why are you assuming that because a child bucks gender norms, she's, a trans boy? And isn't that reinforcing the stereotypes that were my entire childhood was all about rejecting, 1970s feminists, tomboys. That was a popular zeitgeist. And I published that in the New York Times. And that was a very different experience. A, because it was the New York Times, and B, because we had started fighting about trans kids, who they were and what they needed. And there was a lot of backlash, and I hadn't experienced that. It was frightening for me, and lots of threats. And I just didn't even know what to make of it. I didn't understand how what I'd written could be interpreted as hateful. And what I ended up doing was reaching out to some of the people who had written, not everyone, because some people were really crazy and nasty, but some people wrote well-reasoned arguments about what was wrong with my piece. And some of those people I reached out to, and they were willing to meet with me. And I had them explain their points of view. And then I tried to publish that piece, and nobody wanted like super nuanced, look how I reached out to people who disagree with me. And I just wanted to have nothing to do with it. But my agent kept saying, there's really a book here. And I said, can I write about anything else? Can I sell a book on anything else? And we did go through some ideas, and she just kept saying, nope, you're not done here. And I mean, she was right. And even after I wrote the book, I was like, wow, I'm really not done. I wish I could redo it now, because I feel like in the last 6 months, I've learned so much more. But that was, it just kind of had to be done. And then I learned things that I just couldn't believe we didn't all know, and couldn't believe that even as we're talking about trans kids all the time, that there was so much left unsaid. And I tried to put as much of it in there as I could.
What kind of things couldn't you believe, or did you not believe? I don't know how to phrase that. Things that you assumed we should already know, or can't believe we didn't know. What kind of things are those?
Well, the whole first third of the book is about where the idea of boy stuff and girl stuff comes from: haircuts, clothes, colors, activities. And that was really that was really shocking, because what most of us don't know is that we've only been having really gendered childhoods for about 100 years. And we've only been having hyper-gendered childhoods for about 20 years, where, we have prenatal sex testing. So before birth, even, you can paint a room pink and assemble a bunch of princess toys and really, really push the gender role from before the kid even, or gender reveal parties, which are gender stereotype reveal parties. And up until about 100 years ago, young kids, at least, up until about age 6, were generally having what we think of as gender neutral childhoods. And they'd be wearing dresses, because people were making their own clothes. Dresses are much easier to sew than pants. And they all played with the same things. Again, a lot of toys were homemade. So industrialization definitely changed a lot of how we rear children. But the thing that changed how we rear children the most is the rise of psychology and sexology, and understanding homosexuality as a class of people, not just a behavior that someone engaged in. This is especially in the beginning, when there was more looking at feminine gay men. And ironically, but gender and sexuality were kind of mixed together. But when that got separated from sex, you can be a man, but you could be feminine and you could be gay. That really changed the way we reared children, because there was a kind of moral panic about that. And so parents were encouraged and actively, readily accepted the charge to impose a kind of early manhood onto children. So dress them like middle men, give them, toys that show them how to be men. No one ever cares about girls as much, but that was also the beginning of mop and broom toys for girls, and, erector sets for boys, and keep girls in these lacy, frilly, feminine things with flowers that all kids have been wearing, and now only, and put boys in these clothes with balls and bears and masculine things. So it's mostly homophobia and sexism that changed the way we started to raise children. And that seems really important for people to know, because most parents are still participating in that. And that when you teach your kid, like, oh, no, that's for girls, you're teaching them, don't be feminine. Don't like that. Everything that's on that pink side of the pink blue divide is not for you, because you need to be a proper man. And I think if more people knew that, they'd participate in what needs to be a cultural project of relaxing those gender rules and roles.
I really feel for kids today, if a child, let's say a girl is a tomboy, it seems like all these different sort of ideological camps are trying to claim those children as their own. So we've got, the trans advocates saying, oh, that child is trans, let's transition them as early as possible. You've got lesbians saying, no, that child is a lesbian, I want to claim her, or feminists, wanting to claim, that what that means as far as gender nonconformity and expanding what it means to be female or male. So these kids, are just innocently being themselves and are being pulled by these different politics, and it must be a very complicated time for these children to be growing up.
Yeah, and I think also children learn these rules really early, and they police and bully each other a lot. So they learn from each other too. You don't touch that, that's for girls. And I don't think it's very hard to undo that, because there are plenty of studies showing that if we just market things differently, kids will feel like they have more opportunity to explore them or play with them. However, I think these naturally gender nonconforming kids or someone recently called them organically. They just go, for whatever reason, when there's the division, they're going for the gender role of the opposite sex. Even though we know that a lot of this, at least the stuff that's in there, the color blue and, certain kinds of toys, even though we know that that's relatively arbitrary, they're still going that way, and they're going against the grain. And it might not even matter what we put in there, even if we just all decided that pink was for girls, pink was for boys, they might still go there. And I guess I don't feel like even with all of this celebration now of trans kids and fighting over trans kids, I still don't feel like I still don't feel like we understand what to do when a child, what it means when a child does that. And actually, my conclusion was it doesn't mean anything. You cannot know. So today, many of these kids being socially transitioned, because they may be insisting that they're a member of the group because they're drawn to that group, right? And parents are under the impression that social transition is not only the humane thing to do, but what you have to do to prevent your child from committing suicide. So they're allowing that, they're facilitating that, the schools are facilitating that. But actually, from my research, I noticed that almost everyone I interviewed had the same origin story, but they had very different adulthoods. And my feeling was it's almost impossible to tell what childhood gender nonconformity means. And I don't just mean like I'm a girl who plays soccer. I'm talking about we divided into boys and girls, and I went over there with the sex that I am not. And I'm just wondering, did you, Erin Kay, you said that you recognized all these tomboys that I wrote about, and some of them are somewhat feminine. A lot of those people you mentioned did grow up to be lesbians, though. But was that enough for you? Did you feel like one of them, or did you feel fundamentally different from them?
I think I didn't feel like I was like them, though other people said I was like them. There were times when I was accused of, well, you're trying to be Joe from The Facts of Life. It's like, no, I'm just myself. But they were obviously picking up on something that was different about me and different about them, and trying to figure that out, right? Kind of what you're saying. We don't know what to do with gender nonconformity. But I would say that those people that you mentioned from the 70s, I remember having childhood crushes on them, not so much saying they're like me, but I felt drawn to them.
Mm-hmm.
if they ever do like a remake of Little House on the Prairie and cast Laura as a trans boy, I'll be the first one to protest. But that, I mean,
that is happening all the time. And
is.
I did just write a piece about that, because the Anybody's character in West Side Story, who was the tomboy, is now a trans man or a trans masculine person played by a non-binary actor whose sex I don't actually know, but I think I know. And this is happening a lot. And what I talk about in the piece is that our understandings of sex, gender, and sexuality are so rooted in the time we're in and the place we're in. They're so culturally specific. You know, like I said, those things were all rolled together until 100 years ago. So we didn't talk about the sex of a child very much, because that made you think of like future sexuality. So kids were dressed according to age, not sex, right? Until we separated sexuality out from that. And then it was still another 30 years before, you know, gender was really separated out of that. I mean, it was happening a little bit with Hirschfeld in Berlin. And then it was like John Money and those guys here, kind of like, oh, there's something even separate from all of that. It's taken a long time. Now we have an understanding right now of gender identity, and you can have one kind of brain and another kind of body. And I'm always saying, like, we have to let these ideas evolve. This is a popular idea right now, but we are getting information in, or should be taking information in, that says like, oh, there's more to the story than that too. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, we can't look back on people in history and say, oh, that was an oppressed trans person, because they are living in the gender reality of their times. And especially when you look at women who lived as men, women who fought as men in the Civil War, women who were doctors in the early 19th century, they couldn't do that otherwise. You know, you had to be a man. And so we don't know anybody's, you know, from West Side Story. I mean, there were tomboys in the 1950s, but it wasn't like the 1970s when they were celebrated. So if the story took place in the 1970s, maybe she wouldn't have even been like treated so badly until the end of the movie. Maybe they would have just been like, oh yeah, she's one of the guys, and we mean that metaphorically. And now we've imposed this modern understanding of gender, and we're saying, oh, that's a transmasculine person who was born in the wrong body and has to change their body. And that is just an understanding right now. And I think, you know, when you ask me what I learned from this book and what should people know, or, you know, what were these things that I think, like, how can people not know this? To me, that's so important. You know, our understanding is culture bound, and it's time bound. And this is the way we're seeing it right now, but it is not how we saw it before. And we can't look back with this modern lens. And as we move forward, we have to take in the information we don't want to take in. We don't want to take in information about detransitioners. We don't want to take in information about autogynephilia. Like, there's a, you know, the ever growing list of verboten topics, but we actually have to understand and know about them all, because the story has to keep evolving, the story and understanding of gender.
I consider myself fortunate in ways, and you touched on this in the book. Like, I was a child in the 70s and 80s. So we went from the 70s, where girls and boys could look very similar, right? We had the same sort of bowl haircut with the feathers on the sides, like you described, and you know, t-shirt and a pair of shorts, or t-shirt and jeans. So I felt pretty comfortable in the 70s. I miss the 70s maybe for that reason, that just that freedom to, I don't remember thinking there was a big difference between boys and girls through the 70s. And then we went from the 70s to the 80s. 80s gender bending was on full on display. So it really wasn't until there was lots of room for me as a child. And I grew up in a tiny little farming community where it wasn't uncommon for farming women to have short hair and wear plaid shirts, because that was practical. My grandmother was not a fussy woman who had any tolerance for people that did their nails. She was an old school farm woman who worked physically hard. So it really wasn't that difficult for me until sort of the 90s, as I became a teenager, and the social rules became a lot more complicated as everyone was like pairing off into, starting to date, and there wasn't a gay and lesbian community in my tiny little town. So I just felt like, where do I fit now? Because I had lots of friends, both boys and girls as friends. But as teenagers, the boys started acting differently around me and the girls started acting differently around me. And they didn't know what to do with my gender nonconformity and same-sex attraction. I didn't know what to do. So that's when it became difficult. I don't remember struggling much as a young child.
What would, I mean, I would imagine many kids, at least in liberal parts of the world, do feel like it's easier. I mean, at my daughter's school, she was just telling me about a little thing where the two boys had crushes on each other, but they didn't know they were gay at the same time. And then they kind of passed like ships in the night. And, they each had crushes at different times. And I just thought like, these are 7th graders. And this is not a scandal. This is a cute story, So in some ways, I think, maybe it is easier. Maybe it is easier, at least for lesbian and gay kids. And I'm still not sure with our obsession with labeling. I'm still not sure for the genuine, organic, gender nonconforming people, whether they're motivated because of physical differences, whether they're motivated by having like a variation of sex development or whatever, who knows why. I talked about tomboyism as being this protective bubble of ambiguity for young children, and then it evaporated at puberty. And that's when most people I talked to struggled. The ones who conformed after that and became more feminine, it was not hard for them, but it did profoundly impact their lives that they had been tomboys as children. And I'm talking about, pretty heavy duty, hardcore tomboys as children, looked like boys, most of them. Even though that was not hard to do, since we did all have short hair and little track shorts. But, the way that it stayed with them was that they were comfortable around men and masculinity, and it often helped them get better jobs. That this kind of childhood tomboyism is correlated to a bunch of good stuff later, making more money and feeling comfortable in yourself, because you get used to being different in some ways, but then you have the benefit of conformity. So the question is how to extend that bubble into adolescence. And I know that the many teenagers coming out as trans now, it does. I think some of them want a release from gender roles and gender norms. I think that motivates some of the kids of like, once I'm non-binary, there are no rules for me. I interviewed one kid who was like, I never felt comfortable like wearing anything pink or purple when I was a girl, but then I identified as non-binary and now I have purple hair and I don't, so I feel comfortable. So I think it can do some important work, but I still think we are forgetting that you can have one kind of body and that, and act in a way, be in the world in a way that most people don't associate it with that body. Mm-hmm. And that is fine. I just don't, I'm still asking, how can we do that? And what would have been the message that you two would have wanted as you entered puberty? What would have helped you feel like you could navigate the world as yourself?
I had a bit of a different upbringing than I'm a bit younger than you guys. I was born in the mid 80s, so the majority of my conscious childhood took place in the 90s, but I grew up in a very very conservative evangelical environment. So it was in the 90s was the age of girl power and whatnot. Yeah. But I didn't really, but by the time I was conscious of that external messaging, I think I'd already kind of internalized girl is bad. I don't want to be that, just because. So from my upbringing, yes, in the 80s, I think there was more ambiguity about gender roles, certainly in children. But in a conservative Christian environment, it was really hammered home. This is what boys do. This is what girls do. I was allowed to be a tomboy. And in fact, that word wasn't ascribed to me via my family, but I heard that from somewhere externally. I can't remember where. I was described by somebody as a tomboy, and I remember being just overjoyed because I thought that was a kind of boy. So I was like, oh, like, and then I found out that a tomboy was a type of girl, and I was like, okay, no, I don't want to be a tomboy. But so my upbringing was very much girls do this, boys do that, and yes, I gravitated much more towards all of that was boy, but it was I was taught very much that that was wrong, to feel that way, and so it's difficult for me to answer this question just because my upbringing was quite niche and that it was so conservative, and gender was really stringently externally applied. I do wonder, if that wasn't the case and that there was a lot more ambiguity, I was allowed to express and just kind of be. I could present myself how I felt comfortable, things like that. Would that discomfort not have kind of gone to my body as I developed into puberty? I do wonder that a lot. But as far as the grand, I also wanted to. This came to mind when you were talking about the. With industrialization, and I feel also with commercialization, that plays a big factor in basically creating a market category that is gender as well. And so it's so much of what I see is now like this gender religion seems to be like the kind of like this post capitalist construction that is gender. It's almost like we've imposed gender so stringently by industrialization, commercialization, whatever, that we've kind of decided that we have to, like, we've taken it so seriously, and we've internalized it so stringently, is that in order to now break free of it, we actually have to alter our bodies in the, like, there's something dark there. I haven't really formed that thought entirely, but yeah, that's just my weighing and my upbringing as well. What could have, I think what could have helped me not grow into discomfort with my body would have been, just being kind of like what you're explaining, for your daughters and girls in general, is that, this, you can be celebrated, you can behave in any way that feels comfortable. And just the roles and the stringent classification, putting that on children is, I don't see how we can't see that this being, just really harmful.
I think it's very uncomfortable for the adults, right? And it must have been very uncomfortable for your parents when they saw you, veering toward a gender role that they had not assigned to you. You were not behaving as a girl was supposed to, and that's upsetting. And now I think what people are saying is like, oh, well, that's a trans boy, and that's fine. And like, that's making room. And maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. I think we're not taking the medicalization very seriously, or really asking what are the long-term psychological and physical implications of social transition. And but what's interesting about your stories is that you two ended up in the same place. Aaron K did have the freedom of the tomboy childhood, and Aaron T did not, and here you both are. Mm-hmm. So clearly that alone was not sufficient to help you feel like you had a place in this world as you were before you changed your bodies.
It's a difficult question. And I think we've done a disservice too by denying that gender dysphoria is a psychological condition of some kind, right? Because by denying that fact, we have no way of separating, like, what is just a natural variation and a natural diversity of expression where a tomboy still gets to be a girl, versus someone who has the psychological condition gender dysphoria, which are two. There's probably some overlap there, but they are two different things. And I think gender dysphoria as a psychological condition is probably a fairly rare thing.
Or was,
yeah. But I think because we've blurred that line, we're now drawing a lot of just natural gender nonconformity under the trans umbrella, and medicalizing children who didn't necessarily have the psychological condition. They're just gender nonconforming. And that's such a So now we're seeing the numbers of trans people growing and growing and growing and growing because we're medicalizing just natural diversity, which isn't a pathology of any kind. A tomboy is a type of girl. There's no pathology there, and not all tomboys have gender dysphoria.
Or and even there can be extremely masculine girls and extremely feminine boys who are fine with their bodies. Mm-hmm. And they may have a kind of gender dysphoria that could come from, it could be external entirely, could come from nobody understands them. And they feel, they absolutely are not like the majority of people in their category. And they have, they need a word for it. Their parents need a word for it. It's upsetting, Then there are the people who are just fine with it. I mean, there's so many different experiences. And I think there's people assuming that gender nonconformity means that you need to, in kids, means you need to socially transition, is ignoring that. I think what we're doing is we're taking what we know about how to support trans kids. And actually, I'm going to take that back. I think we're taking what we know about how to support extremely gender dysphoric people and applying it to the entire society. Mm-hmm. So, I took my kid and another mother and kid. We all went out, and there were some other kids there. And this mother said, "Oh, that child's going by they, them pronouns. Now I've got to remember that because you have to affirm." This was a completely gender conforming female with no dysphoria at all. But the mom was applying these rules or ideas associated with kids in extreme distress, who maybe you do want to use their chosen pronoun or their chosen name because they are really having a hard time functioning at a basic level. And now we're saying we have to do that for all kids, but that's not where that comes from. And also support and affirm are not the same things. And I just think I think it's worth examining everything, all of this. I think we should take everything out of the package and look at it. And there are more people who are gender dysphoric. They might not be trans. There are more trans people. They might not be gender dysphoric. So, and then there might be a small overlap of people who are both trans and gender dysphoric. And maybe for those people, medicalization is right. And I'm not sure how you tell exactly. I have spoken to many people who feel that with very careful evaluation and even, I've spoken to people who run pediatric gender clinics who are incredibly concerned about the fast tracking of medicalization and concerned about, again, people not understanding that when we say support or affirm or use the pronouns, that we are talking about a specific cohort of highly distressed children. And we're not just talking about every single child out there. And some of these people have really, really stringent methods of evaluation and want kids to look at videos of detransitioners and really want to tell them exactly what we know and don't know and what might happen to their bodies. And those people tend to not want to do any media because they don't want any scrutiny. Those are the people who've been doing it a long time when it was super niche, when people would think it was horrible. People on the left would think that was just madness, right? And now they think it's madness not to do it. Again, we're talking about what we keep seem to be going back to are these cultural shifts, these zeitgeist shifts. And everyone needs to understand that this happens all the time. We swing and we swing back and we swing and we swing back. Aaron T was raised in the hypergendering time of girl power when we took the kind of masculine tomboyism of the 70s, and those people who were reared that way then had kids, and then they were like, what's powerful? Being super hot and pretty and super feminine, right? And then so that was a zeitgeist shift. Like, never mind masculinity, femininity is powerful. Now we have the first generation of people who were reared with like completely hypergender childhoods with prenatal sex testing, with every possible toy divided into pink and blue, with marketers realizing, oh my God, this is a gold mine. So we're just going to exploit this. And some of those people are rejecting all of this. You know, some of those people are putting X's on their birth certificates. It's a zeitgeist shift, but it's really important that the information we have today builds on what we already have, not displaces what we already have. And that's my concern. And that's my concern for the gender nonconforming kids. And yeah, I think we can't lose sight of the history and knowledge that's come before. I feel like I just rambled and I don't even know where I started.
That's awesome. I mean,
that was great stuff.
What had started that? I don't know.
Well, you said one of the questions you had was just what would have helped, and it's a hard question. I don't know for sure what would have helped me, but I did have a sense, like for as long as I could remember. I mean, yes, I was attracted to things that were maybe more stereotypically boyish, but I really did believe that I was a boy, and that's maybe the difference between the classic early onset childhood gender dysphoria versus tomboy, because I think that there are a lot of tomboys who are equally maybe attracted to more masculine things, but were confident, right, and bold about that, and still understood that they were female.
Yeah.
And that was the difference between maybe that kind of tomboy that you describe in the book, who had this, like, you know, this energy of confidence. I didn't have that energy of confidence because I was making that error, that cognitive categorization error is what I've been calling it, because I don't know what else to call it, but I was making that error that I am a boy, and that undermined my confidence, because I felt like something's wrong with me, and so that was always part of my narrative, is something's wrong with me. And then so then when other people are interacting with me and would, even in the 70s, when, you're right, boys and girls kind of looked the same in the 70s, I would still have kids come up to me and say, what's up with you? You look like a boy, and I heard you're a girl, and that's weird, right? So this constant message, like, not just you're a tomboy, but there's something wrong with you. And so I think what I needed, and the theme that I keep coming back to, is what I needed was a framework for understanding my experience. I needed meaning, and I needed for that to not just be my personal meaning, but a cultural meaning that normalized my experience and said, okay, this is, you know, someone said, okay, what this means is you are a butch lesbian, or this means you are this or that. Like, if I just had a framework to understand it, and that somehow that enabled me to still belong in the world and still connect with my peers, I think that might have been enough. But it was just so confusing for me. It was like this vacuum of understanding where I needed a narrative, I needed meaning to make sense of what I was experiencing, because I didn't know about trans people back then. I didn't know about gender dysphoria back then. Like, these are complicated concepts that we're just now even unpacking. So I had no framework. So it made, when I saw a documentary on TV about trans kids, and they were saying, they were interviewing these kids that were describing an experience that sounded exactly like mine, of really believing that they were the opposite sex. And then the documentary said, well, if you feel this way, it's because you are a trans person.
Yeah.
So that was the first time it's like, okay, finally, I have this framework of understanding. I have a language to describe what I was experiencing. But I don't know that narrative is true, right? So I grabbed hold of that narrative because I needed something to understand my experience and describe it to other people. But the trans narrative, I don't think, is entirely true. And I think it might have been more helpful if someone had talked to me about gender dysphoria and what that is and what that means, and that a lot of gay and lesbian people experience gender dysphoria, especially in childhood, and really talking to me, you know, in terms of the evidence basis for what we understand about gender dysphoria. Is I hope something that we will eventually have those answers that grounds us firmly in reality, because the trans narrative pulls us out of reality, and I don't see that as being psychologically healthy. And I think that's, you know, where Aaron and I have both landed, because you're right, we have different backgrounds. We both converged on the point of medicalizing and you know, living as the opposite sex. But I hope that we and we've gone through different ways of thinking about that through our transitions, and both landed on this place like this narrative is kind of BS. Like these things that we're being taught about gender and sexuality, it's not adding up, and there's so many contradictions, and then we crash, right? Because this framework that they've given us doesn't hold up to scrutiny. It doesn't make sense. There's lots of logical fallacies in this queer theory conceptualization of trans that anyone that takes the time to scratch the surface of it, it very quickly unravels. So if you've built your entire identity on something that is so easily unraveled, we experienced a crash personally, as individuals, and I think this whole community, as we start to pull on these threads, and I think that's why there's so much resistance, right, to talking about it and unpacking it, is that it's a very loosely knit narrative that as soon as you pull a thread, the whole thing falls apart in your hands. So, and that's very psychologically traumatizing, and I'm worried about this entire community bottoming out and falling apart when that happens.
Well, what about the people it does work for? I guess I want to know more about when you say like the trans narrative, what that means to you.
Well, I think it used to be, because it used to be psychologists that led the field, and there was more scientific inquiry into what is gender dysphoria. And I think back, in like the 80s and into the 90s, even into the early 2000s, there was still talk about gender identity disorder as a psychological condition. And it's even some of the butch lesbians were talking about that we've got GID. There was a butch lesbian photographer in Vancouver who did an entire art show called GID, and it was just, butch lesbians. So that was part of the narrative back then, as we understood this as, at least the homosexual subtype, this is part of the landscape of gay and lesbian people. And you often see gender nonconformity within gay and lesbian culture historically. And that shifted to this queer theory starting in the early 90s. And then it just, when queer theory first was established in academia, we've seen that queer theory based narrative take over and replace our understanding of what trans means. That it's now, that trans is like a type of person that is just innate to our being. It's not a psychological condition. It's just, you are a trans person, I think is the most significant change, which eliminates the possibility of living with it without medicalizing. If you think of it as a psychological condition that some gay and lesbian people experience, it opens up the possibility that you can be a lesbian with this condition and live with it and integrate that into your identity without ever identifying as trans or medicalizing it. But when you label it trans, I think it does put into your mind that, okay, what I need to do then is medicalize it and become a trans boy or a trans girl.
So with all you two know now, what would you say to someone who was like you, who was at any age, at age 5, at age 12, at age 20? What is it that we need to be saying to kids? What's not in this conversation? We've got this new conversation that's like, here's this category, and here's one of these trans kids, and let's, you can live as the opposite sex, and we'll all accommodate you and rearrange everything. And that makes them feel better. In my experience, the people I know who've done that, and at least, and then we've got, and I'm talking about organically non-conforming people who are more likely than not to be gay later. Obviously that doesn't cover everybody. I'm not talking about the teenagers with no history of anything who with having mental health problems, and not, what people refer to as rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is very odd to me that this has been rejected by so many people, because most of the experienced clinicians, whether they don't want to use that term, but they know this is, it's very, very clear in all the literature that there are all these teenage girls and more teenage boys, and who likely it used to just be young men with autogynephilia, and those would be the teenagers you see. And also they'd be unlikely to desist the later they came out, the less likely to desist, likely because they were autogynephilic males that now are inside baseball. But they now we have this new cohort who we just have very little research about, is my understanding. And
a new cohort of clinicians, right? Because since the 90s, like when the queer theory started to displace the science in how we understand trans, I mean, we've got this whole cohort of clinicians who started their careers after that major paradigm shift. And so also, they've probably been taught that, all of the studies about what gender dysphoria is, they've been taught that that's all been debunked and that's all garbage and that's a harm to the trans community, that we think of it as a pathology and that's, an attack on their dignity. And so they've been taught something very different than what the clinicians before them had been taught. So I don't know that they've retained any understanding of this as a psychological condition.
And that goes back to why I say we need to build on the information we already have and not displace it. I think that's very dangerous. I know some of it's outdated, or I know times have changed. It does not mean that we shouldn't be taking the information in that 80% of the kids with gender dysphoria desisted and 70% of them were gay. I mean, we can't, yes, it was a different time and it was harder to be trans, but it's still valuable data. And I just wanted to add that journalists are also being trained differently, and very, especially since Trump. And so I think they're also reporting, they're also trained. If you see any left or center publication that mentions the desistance literature, it's just to say why we shouldn't listen to it. Whereas I'm, as a journalist, taking it in and saying, this changes everything I've been reporting on, which is actually what happened to me when I hadn't seen that literature, even while I was writing my book. I wasn't looking for that. I wasn't asking those questions. But I do think journalists I think journalists, doctors, psychologists are all being trained the same way. They're all being trained to protect marginalized people and not speak inconvenient truths. And that's very dangerous for journalists. But I also think, just going back to the question I didn't finish asking, which was for the kids like you who were gender dysphoric early on, who had a sense of I'm in the wrong, something's wrong. I'm in the wrong category. Something's wrong with me. Now you've interviewed lots of people. You've studied a lot. You've experienced this from multiple perspectives, pre-transition, post-transition, with a kind of standard trans ideology of, born in the wrong body. And now with, there's decades of research that complicates that narrative. I mean, what is the message we should be delivering?
All I can think to say is and this is going to sound dark, but it's why you shouldn't need to medically abuse your body in order to conform to a kind of a social classification, a social categorization, right? The category isn't necessarily wrong. I mean, a lot of people not really perform gender, but these stereotypes exist for a reason, and that is that a lot of people just naturally, girls naturally behave in one way and boys naturally behave in another way. By and large, there are many people who many kids who blur that classification and don't fit in the classification that that their, let's say their sex designates them to, doesn't, but it's they just don't fit in that categorization, and that's great. Be the tomboy, be the effeminate boy, it just seemed, I think the way to address this and the way to answer that question is you don't need to abuse your body. You don't need to damage your body. You don't need to medically alter yourself in order to kind of, to take the round, the round kid and bang him down into a square, to fit into the square hole. I'm not sure if that metaphor makes any sense here, but you know what I'm saying is I think, the celebrating medicalization. If we just take a step back and look at this from a historical lens, it's this is not going to bode well. This is not going to look good. This is not going to have been a good thing that we did in order to accommodate, gender nonconformity. It's just tell the kids that their bodies aren't wrong. Your body is not wrong. It doesn't need to be fixed. The classification may not be wrong either, but it doesn't have, neither has to be true. We don't have to say, oh, the category is wrong. The category could be right, but it doesn't fit with you, but you don't have to change your body in order to fit within a category.
Yeah.
Is all I would say.
Because one of the things you touched on in the book, Lisa, was this, that tomboys, for the most part, are pretty socially acceptable up to a point, right? There's a point that we kind of indulge it as, you kind of laugh about it, you're a tomboy, but there's this expectation that you're going to grow up to be a heterosexual feminine woman and get married and have kids and be normal. So I think that kind of hit home for me, because I think that was very much true for me through my childhood, that for the most part, people left me alone, and I had lots of friends. I mean, me being more masculine presenting and behaving didn't seem to be a social barrier for me as a young child. And I mean, there was definitely some sort of pushback and hints, parents saying, well, could you wear a dress and could you do, so there was some of that, but for the most part, people left me alone and I was fine. And I think I was fairly emotionally healthy until puberty, when there was that societal expectation. Okay, now you gotta kind of drop this tomboy thing, and you need to start moving in the direction of being a heterosexual female. I think it might have been helpful if there was some way that I could just continue to be myself through adolescence and into adulthood, that I was still allowed to have the interests that I had. I was still allowed to have male friends and interact with them as peers and buddies, not you're being weird around me and you're either trying to flirt with me or you want nothing to do with me, or your girlfriend doesn't like you hanging out with another girl, or whatever. Like, that all became so socially weird. And I remember when my grandpa died, all of his tools were distributed amongst all the grandchildren boys, and yet I was the one that was more handy and into building stuff more than my brother was, and my brother got all the tools and I didn't get any. And so things like that, like I felt like, I think one of the drives for me to transition was, the world is not seeing me in terms of my temperament and my personality and my interests. It's like, I need to do this to my body so that you actually recognize who I am. And so there is that for me, and it wasn't about recreating a persona. It was, I need to do something so that the world actually engages with me in a way that's authentic for me. And I didn't see that I could do that in any other way. So if I was still allowed to hang out with my dad and his buddies and learn how to fix his car and learn how to, use a hammer, and because he just sort of had this attitude, well, you're a girl, so of course you're not going to know what a Phillips screwdriver is. Like, so there was that as I got older and older and older, more and more and more of a push that you got to drop this tomboy thing.
Yeah. And maybe that is, maybe that is improving. And again, I feel like, well, sometimes these new words we have are helping people do that, even though they feel like they have to like change names or pronouns in order to do that, when we really shouldn't have to do anything, to allow someone to be themselves. We could de-emphasize sex and gender instead of emphasizing it in different ways, and just be saying, as this is your body and it doesn't determine that much about you. And it's great. It's great. It's perfect. It's a beautiful body. And you may or may not be like other people who have this body, but don't worry about that. That's nothing. That's, we're really, really emphasizing it. And my desire is to de-emphasize it. But I also am aware, I'm aware that people have changed their bodies and they're really happy about it. And that there are, what you said reminds me of those kind of the people who are gender dysphoric because of external pressure versus people who are like something, I would imagine, with autogynephilia. It's got nothing to do with how people are treating you or your dad, insisting you perform a female gender role. That is really internal, and you're wanting to change your body, not so people will treat you in a certain way, but because that is you have an overwhelming desire to have a female body. And I think those are really different things. And again, if we were going, instead of just affirming everyone, if we were going to be asking questions and gathering data, we would look at those two very different experiences. But I'm aware, I've talked to lots of people who are very happy they changed their bodies and their pronouns and their names, and they're super comfortable. And their perspective is, why are all of you people out there assuming that this is a worst case scenario? Why are you trying to prevent everyone from becoming me when I'm happy? And I think that's a polite way of putting it. But that, I think about that perspective a lot. They're like, why is cis better than trans? But I think what we need to remember when people express that sentiment is, we're actually not talking about how you identify. We're talking about transforming bodies in ways that you cannot take back. And that if you have a kind of gender dysphoria that is rooted in the culture, that this may not be the solution for you. Mm-hmm. And so we've got to distinguish between these different kinds of gender dysphoria. And we've got to figure out where gender dysphoria is really about a trans identity, or about autogynephilia, about having a kind of sexuality that is, all about, I see my way of being sexual is to see myself as a woman, and I want a woman's body. But actually there are even some young people who are admitting. There's one guy, I don't know if you've seen this video on YouTube, of a very young, handsome fella somewhere in the UK. And he's talking about autogynephilia, and he's got a video on why he probably will never need surgery, because he understands this about himself and he knows what it is. Mm-hmm. And that video really had a big impact on me, because I thought this is the problem with tamping down the research and denying people access to it, or saying that we shouldn't listen to it. The research on desistance, the research on autogynephilia, the connection between gender and sexuality that's so well established in this culture and many other cultures, is that then people don't understand themselves. And I think what you two have been talking about is, it took a really, really long time to understand yourself, because you had limited access to information that was dependent on the zeitgeist, the gender zeitgeist of your time. And even in this era that we have this new, supposedly expansive zeitgeist, it's dependent on keeping certain information out that you both needed to understand yourselves. And you might have made different choices or you might not have, I don't know, if you'd had the information. But
it's hard to say, but I think as a young child, I think it's really important for the kids and their parents and teachers to understand, especially you mentioned the desistance studies, and it's not just one. I mean, there's quite a few desistance studies that all say the exact same thing, even though the numbers are a little bit different from study to study, but they all say pretty much the same thing, that the vast majority of these kids do end up being comfortable in their sex bodies, and most of those kids end up being gay or lesbian. And that certainly wasn't the message that me and my family got as when I was a child, right? If someone had come to my family and because I think we all knew there was something different about me, and none of us knew how to make sense of that. And I think it would have been helpful for someone to come in, when I was 5 or 10 or whatever age, and said, there's gender nonconformity here. There's what we call as gender identity disorder going on here, where Erin really thinks that she's a boy in some way, and that's what this is. And to tell us, you just be you, just love your child, accept your child, let your child experiment, knowing that the vast majority of the time, this probably means she's going to be a lesbian. Could you introduce her to some lesbians? Could you bring in role models, bring in some very kind of masculine women into her life to help support and make sense of this? Instead, whereas now we're kind of pushing all these families and kids. Okay, you've got a trans child, so let's start a social transition. Let's kind of point them in the direction of eventually medicalizing their bodies. And I don't think that's the right approach. And I hope that the gay and lesbian community starts to talk about, because they were probably that 88% of children that desisted, right? So where are they? We need them to start speaking up and saying, yep, that was me. I was gender nonconforming as a child, and now I'm a happy, healthy gay man or a happy, healthy lesbian. We really need them to start entering into this conversation with us.
What I wanted to add is,
well, I want to hear what you have to say, but I'm so forgetful that I'm like, I better say this. I think what's happening is, in these studies, let's say 12% did not desist, right? And then they went on and they wanted to change their bodies, and they were persistently trans, and they are very mad, right? That they had to go through all that, and that they felt unsupported, and they don't want anyone else to have to go through that. Let's say that's what's motivating them. And but I think what's happening is that we're part of our zeitgeist is the minority, the marginalized minority, we have to protect them, so we have to rearrange everything for them. So now we're actually serving that 12% more than 8%. I don't know if there were how many kids actually would have stayed, right? Like if this was all like, oh yeah, that's fine, trans is an option, and they were, we have no idea. We're living in a different zeitgeist now. I don't know how many times I've said the word zeitgeist in this talk, but I think that's what we're doing, is we're gearing it all toward the 12% instead of the 88%. And maybe that's one place we need to be looking for clues, is we're forgetting about doing what's best for the majority, while still understanding that this very well may persist, and that a medical transition may be the best way for some people to soothe their dysphoria. But I think we understanding that most of the time they'll grow out of it, and that we don't want to aim everything toward this small group. And I think that's hard to do. How do you keep it open so that the people who will eventually want to transition don't feel shamed, don't feel like you made it impossibly hard for them, but still understand that, we're supposed to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people.
I like to think it would be helpful for kids to at least have a language to start to talk about it. And that's something that, like kids growing up in the 70s, we didn't have. We didn't have a language, really, at least I didn't in my environment, to just talk openly about it. I kept it a secret that I had this, this belief that I was a boy, because I felt this is weird. No one else in the world is experiencing this. Like, what's wrong with me? So I was really ashamed of it and never talked about it. And I think it would be really helpful for any kid's emotional development to be able to have a language and safe, supportive adults to just talk openly about it. Because how do you support somebody when it's this big kind of dirty secret that someone is keeping?
I wanted to say that, I was talking quite darkly about transition, but I wanted to say that I was incredibly happy with my transition. I felt like the physically altering my body, it brought more relief and more contentment than I ever anticipated even going into it. And I felt that way I still feel that way, but I have to reconsider it in the current lens that I'm aware of. Is like a few years ago is when I got wind of the reality that what I experienced, what I call gender dysphoria, is not what other people experienced, and not what we're all collectively referring to as trans now. And there's so many different life experiences and internal motivations that lead somebody to transition. And that's when I had to step back and go, we are solving very vague, varied internal feelings with this very intense and specific medical response to it. And that's when I had to kind of go and that's why I keep thinking, again, I like your term that you keep using, zeitgeist, because it's so important to continue to keep looking at that, at where we are now, as a specific cultural moment that we're in. And it's not how it's always been, and it's certainly not how it's going to be moving forward, I don't believe. But what I wanted to also add, one one more thing is that's why I think with what Gender Dysphoria Alliance is doing, it's so important that we do, as trans people, talk about all that is trans, all that is gender dysphoria, and kind of bring that to the fore, because I feel like theoretically we should have more leeway to be allowed to do that than cis people are, right? Like to be like, hey, look at this, examine it from this angle, just because of our trans experience, as it were. So we can add that kind of leverage. But what you were saying about how, those 12% who didn't desist, those are now the trans people today who are saying, if I had been allowed to transition when I was young, that would have, alleviated so much distress and, made me, more passable now, yada, yada. And then the majority of those kids who did desist, who are now most likely, gay or lesbian, living their lives completely removed from the trans conversation, they start getting wind of what's going on over the last couple of years and being like, oh, hold on a minute. I had that experience, but it went away. And then again, but because they aren't speaking from their lane, it's like, oh, shut up, cis person. You can't contribute to this conversation. So I think that's one of those cultural trends, the moment that we're in, that's propagating this trans-only narrative. This transition is beautiful, is that the only people who are allowed to speak are those who did benefit from it. So, or though, and not those. So anyone who desisted is like, oh, that's a cis person, so they can't weigh on a trans issue. And that's why that, let's say that theoretical 12% are the steam train that's allowing this to go on, because they're the only voices who are allowed to weigh in this cultural time of everybody has to stay in their lane, as it were.
And I think I was saying that before, I think the same thing has happened in journalism, which I think is a huge, I think the media is a huge part of the problem here. I know I'm a member of it, and I've really been trying to solve this problem, because we are also having, it's in publishing in general, what's really valued now is your identity and your social category, and only you can report on it because no one else can understand it. And it's really the opposite of what, the pinnacle of journalism was objectivity. Well, I have nothing to do with this, so it makes it easier for me to report on it. Now we are aware that there's no such thing, and we all have biases, but because everyone has a bias, we can't, you have to be able to report on it, whether you're a member of this group or not. And if you are a member of this group, you have to still be able to see it from multiple perspectives. And I think that the media is caught up in the same thing, which is we can't have anyone comment on this. We can't have any perspective that will be accused of bias in some way. And I told you guys the story before, but I had tried to write for a big news organization where I was writing pretty standard news stories about gender, not pretty essays, think pieces. And I wanted to write a story about multiple approaches to gender dysphoria. So I wanted to include talking about therapeutic approaches, and that actually medicalization isn't the only way. Now, this actually every person writing about it should be mentioning this. And I also wanted to talk about a little bit how it's hard to know we are saying a trans kid is any kid who says they're trans, but actually it's gender dysphoria and trans are not interchangeable. And I just wanted to point this out. And I wanted to get some support because I thought I might get really bashed on social media. So I just wanted to make sure I wouldn't be, that my editor knew what I was doing and that she would have my back if they came, if somebody came for me with the threats, or that I could still work.
Pitchforks.
Yeah. Just that I would, anyway, I wanted some institutional support. I'm a freelancer. I don't have a community. I don't have a tribe. And I also didn't have a ton of people to talk to about this. Now I've met more and more people who want to have this complicated conversation. So I feel like I have a little bit of a community now, which has changed everything for me. Because I feel less crazy. I mean, I feel crazy, but not about this. You are also seeing that we've covered this totally wrong, right? So anyway, instead, what happened was the story that they said, no, don't write the story. And I never wrote another story about that particular issue again. for them. But one of the things I thought was interesting was that they said, well, you're biased, and you're biased because you want to protect the tomboy category. And if you think about what that is what it's saying is, I want to make sure that children can be gender nonconforming without being medicalized, which is, I think, an extremely reasonable position. I'm not telling no one to do it. I'm not saying ban it. I'm not out there with those flags. I'm saying gender nonconformity is natural, and the press isn't covering this right. These are my two things that I like. I'm sure about, and I'm really unclear about everything else. So I just thought it was interesting that I was marked as biased. And what marked me as biased was that I wanted to have many different viewpoints in an article. And that's super troubling, right?
Yeah.
We're going to write about this issue, and we can only talk to those 12%. And I don't want to disparage those 12%. I don't want to, you have the right to live as you want to live. And I understand if you want to spare people pain, but unfortunately, I think a lot of people are being caused pain because they are confused, because they're in the 88% and not the 12, whatever the numbers are. The numbers would be different today. We should replicate these studies. I think every single person who is socially, or child who is socially or physically transitioned, should be followed for 15, 20 years, because I think we need to know what we're doing and if it's safe and effective and healthy. I can't believe that this is radical, but I think that I have now taken in all this information, and that's where I've landed. And all I want to do is make sure everybody has the information that I have. And I have written for very large news organizations. I've written hundreds of articles about everything, but I've also written many articles about gender. I've written a nonfiction book about gender, about the psychology, history, biology of gender nonconformity. I should have my bona fides to be able to do this, and I have not been able to disseminate this information. And it's vital. It's vital that everybody, wherever you stand on this, knows all of this, all the information, all the desistance literature, and then, maybe the studies that show things are going well, and that we have the ability to understand, how to read those studies, which is admittedly pretty difficult for me. And to make sure we have not just short-term research, and then we can make decisions. And then we can also allow our zeitgeist, just working it in one last time, to evolve, right? Instead of insisting that it stay right here. And for it to stay right here, we have to edge out so much important information. We've got to let the story evolve. We've got to let the story develop. And, and we were talking about before, right now, independent media, like your podcast, is how we're going to do it. But most people are so poorly informed. We do have to get the mainstream media involved. And again, I'm not advocating that we ban anything or make anyone feel bad or say, I have my personal feelings, but they're not important. My personal feelings about how I'd like the world to be are not important in this story. All that's important is all the information to everybody who is participating in this, and even those who aren't, because the way we're teaching gender in schools is we're teaching everyone how to think about it, and we're missing so much important information. When you teach that gender is a feeling, just a feeling, and not a system designed to make you behave a certain way based on your sex, or when you teach that gender and sexuality are not connected, when we know that they do have a relationship of some kind. It's touching everybody's lives right now. So we really need to properly inform people, just so that we can have a real discussion and decide what to do that's fair and safe.
I can appreciate how hard it would be to even do really good research about any of this right now. To replicate the desistance studies, for example, we live in a world of ideological capture. I don't know how watchful waiting would even work now with kids, because there is this push on any gender nonconforming kid, this push towards trans, and that carrot dangled in front of them of, well, you could medicalize, right? It is such a tempting carrot to grab. and then the other part of just people in the trans community really really sticking to the narrative and never wanting to say anything that contradicts the narrative, right? And that fear that it's this very kind of stubborn, I don't know what to even call that, but just, yeah, this this capture and this fear to ever stray and dissent from the political narrative. So I don't know, like if you were even to survey all trans people and say, you know, are you happy with it? Like, how are you doing 20 years later? I don't know that we can count on the trans community to be really honest about some of those survey questions, because they're always going to answer according to the political narrative. And I don't even know that people are doing that consciously. I just think that if they can't scratch the surface of that narrative because they're too afraid to, how are they ever going to really reflect honestly on how this is going for them? And there's such a loyalty to other trans people too. It's like, well, I don't want to complain about this botched surgery that I had because I don't want to compromise it for all the other trans people who could benefit from it. And we don't even know what those ratios are. Like, do we know that, like, maybe 80% of the time these surgeries aren't going well and people aren't happy with it? But if they're not willing to honestly say that because they don't want to, maybe they're assuming that 80% are benefiting from it and they're the tiny percentage that aren't. And so we don't even really know, I think, honestly, what these numbers and ratios look like, because everyone is just sort of towing the party line and won't ever speak anything that could possibly compromise or contradict that party line.
Well, I think also you lose your community. There's such a huge price to pay for speaking up. And, you know, I just got a community.
Yeah.
And I don't even know what it is. You know, I'm not gender critical. I just know that there are people who are concerned and want to tell a more complicated truth. And those are my people, you know, but
the heterodox community.
But and I'm grateful for them. You know, I'm grateful there are people out there who are like, we cannot be looking through this narrow a lens, but I can understand what a great risk it is to speak out and be, you know, the detransitioners, the ones who are detransitioning because of regret, which I think is most of them now. But who knows? Because we just really have Lisa Littman study, and we just need to be researching everything. And I think the trans people who feel like they were guinea pigs for years and mistreated are like, don't research us at all, because, you know, we just want to be ourselves. And I get it. I do really understand this point of view, but unfortunately there are a lot of people medicating who aren't happy with it and aren't trans. And, you know, we have to open the whole thing up and look critically at it so we can figure out what to do. So you're not, you know, if trans is this huge umbrella, well, you know, you have to figure out not everyone under that umbrella is going to have their mental health improved by radically altering their body. And some of them are going to have their mental health destroyed by it. Seems really important to figure out who's who.
Yeah. And even amongst the trans people that would say that they're happy with their transition, I've heard some of them say, you know, had the world been different where they felt like they could just exist in the world and have community and support for who they were, they probably wouldn't have felt driven to medicalize their bodies. And so it's all, you know, it's all well and good to say, yes, I mean, we need to work towards a world in which gender nonconformity can just exist naturally and we can be healthy and happy. But the reality is we haven't lived in that world. So we can't, I don't want to be judged, and I don't want to judge other trans people for having made this decision, because it's their gender nonconformity interacting with the world that we live in. And we don't live in one world. We live in different cultures and different families. And, you know, what things look like in my tiny little farming community is different than somebody who grew up in a, you know, liberal upper middle class family in the big city. You know, we have these different realities. We're not living in a single culture. We live in North America. We've got many cultures within North America. So
Well, and also at the World Abroad, like you were saying, Lisa, that Tomboy is about to be published in Japan. It's like that's going to have a completely different perspective in Japan, like how gender is kind of categorized over there is. I think it seems to me be much more stringent even than here, right? Like, so it's very interesting to look at, not this conversation, not just in our current time, but around the world, it's going to look very, very different.
In fact, tomboy in many parts of Asia is a category for adult females who are either butch or trans. And I didn't have time to get into that in the book. It just felt like, that's a whole other thing. But and also I thought I would get a giant advance and have a tour of Asia and write about Asian tomboys. But they have tomboy in the Philippines. There's a tomboy like beauty contest where these super masculine women go out and parade themselves. And it's a kind of a sexuality in Thailand, a tom. So the word endures there. It's out of favor here. And it's directly connected to gender and sexuality in adult women. And that line that seems to be very loose there between trans and butch, which is interesting. And I guess that just goes back to, we're understanding this in our own cultural context. And gender nonconforming people have always existed, and they're pretty much in every culture. And I think we're the only culture. I think the West is the only place where we're medicalizing them. But I think that's because that's not an option in those other cultures. But
in Thailand and in South Asia, certainly in male to female transitioners.
That's true.
And it's
Thailand. It's big business. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of people are flown over there for SRS. But that really is. I like that what you just said about the tomboys in the Philippines and elsewhere, because I always thought like Helen Joyce wrote about this in her book. I don't know if you read Trans When Ideology, but she talks about how there's all these cultures that have a classification for the highly effeminate male. Yeah. And it kind of serves to preserve the classification of masculinity, right? Yes. And so I was wondering, does that exist in cultures where there is like a subclassification of women that is highly masculine women? And
so yes, there's the Fa'afafine, there's the males, right. Now the Muxas of Mexico, the Hydra. There are a bunch of others I can't remember how to say them, something like the Trastevere of Brazil, something like that. And these are all highly feminine, androphilic males. So we would think of as feminine gay men, but that's not how they think of them there. However, they have a category for them, and they are understood. And in some places they're tolerated, and in some places they're oppressed. And so in some places they're fully accepted. But most of those places, it's not okay to be gay. So this right. is like the way the culture understands them. There are women too. There are women in those, the Muxas, whatever that. Unfortunately, I don't even know the female names for them. There is some female version of Fa'afafine. Generally, cultures are less concerned with when women are more masculine, right? And as you were talking about, Aaron K., in farm communities, there are women or even in the Midwest, women with short hair and plaid shirts and work boots. And, but yes, there are often female versions of those categories, but they're in much fewer numbers and far less studied. And I think that's because we just tend to not be as interested in women. And when we first started gendering childhood, it really was much more about making the boys be straight than it was about making the girls be passive. I mean, that was part of it, but the real panic was over boys' sexuality. So I do often wonder if having a category would help us, and that maybe sometimes the category of non-binary, like I said before, can do that work. And that's also increasingly associated with medicalization to make you look neither male nor female. So and you still have to change things about yourself, change your name or your pronouns or your appearance And I don't want to say that that's inherently a problem. I'm just saying if the idea is just acceptance and understanding, again, I think de-emphasizing sex and gender would be really nice. It's the total opposite of where our culture is going. But I think it's super helpful to locate how we're handling these subjects right now in cultural context, in temporal context, to look at what happens in other cultures and to see, is there more acceptance or understanding there? Is there something we can learn from there? We're often doing the opposite and saying like there are trans people in these cultures, but it's a very different, that's imposing our understanding onto them. Some people call that colonialization, like of gender in other cultures. And I think it's important to pause and take in as much information as we can and then try to assimilate it. And I think it's important to ask these questions that we haven't really come up with clear answers, right? I mean, you would be the best experts in the world on how should we help these genuinely gender nonconforming children feel comfortable and find a place in society. And it's still, even knowing all it's still hard to find the answers. To me, that's an indication that we have to keep searching for them. And we have to keep asking the question over and over till we come to a place where it's acceptable to question, where dissent is valuable, and where we look at all the research and are comfortable with how hard it is to figure out what to do.
Well put.
Well said. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to us. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun to talk to you both.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.